Welcome to Davenant Discussions. I'm Bradley Belschner, here today with Bradford Littlejohn. Today we're talking about the fourth pillar in Davenant Trust's vision, that of essentials. We're exploring how essentials works itself out in daily practice, using the question of public schools. Should Christians avoid public schools or send their kids to public schools? Is this an essential thing? So, Brad, one of the stumbling blocks that a lot of Christians have here is the question of the government's role. Should the government even be involved in educating children in the first place? What do you have to say about that?
I think the fact that many modern Christians have this concern is really a fairly modern concern. And I think a lot of it rises out of the increasing centralization of our national education system. Decisions that used to be taken by local school boards or maybe state departments of education are increasingly controlled from the federal government, which just means even if all things being equal, there's a sense of loss of control, loss of accountability, loss of sense of connection between the communities that are actually where the education is happening and where the decisions are being made. So that makes people distrustful of the government. And also the fact that I think our current federal government's priorities have become increasingly hostile to Christian values and Christian truth makes people distrustful of the government. But they frame this often as the government as such shouldn't be involved in education. And that, I don't think, is really, certainly it's not a historical perspective. I think, if you look at the Protestant Reformation, one of the first things the reformers did when they broke away from Rome was to say, okay, we need to get, they would call upon the city councils, the Christian magistrates, the Christian monarchs, and say, hey, we need to get good Christian education happening here in this country, in this city. So they didn't see that as just not being a function of government. And even though we might have a good argument about what the proper role of the church is versus the state, I don't see a compelling case for saying as a matter of principle, this is not a government function.
But isn't it the parents who are charged to educate their children? Aren't they the ones with that responsibility, parents?
Sure, but parents, there's a lot of responsibilities that parents have that they delegate, right? Very few parents can oversee every aspect of their children's education directly. There's a few who can, and great, but normally they have to delegate certain aspects of it. I mean, they're delegating a lot of theological instruction to their pastors, you could say, in a way. And that's fine as long as parents take ultimate responsibility for it and don't say, oh, well, my child went bad because they had a bad teacher. So the parents are responsible to keep an eye on those to whom they're delegating, but they can delegate.
Okay, so that might be fine in the abstract, but in the environment that we have right now, we have government schools that are teaching us subjects from a non-Christian perspective. You could say that, in a sense, they're teaching secular atheism to our children. And shouldn't that be something we want to avoid? We don't want that kind of philosophical, religious influence on our children. We want everything to be taught from a Christian perspective. Isn't that right?
I think that would certainly be ideal, yes, to have everything taught from a Christian perspective. I think there's some areas of study in which the lack of explicitly Christian perspective doesn't do that much harm. You can have a very good trigonometry teacher who's an atheist. He may not be able to give a good ontological account of why trigonometry works, but he can still teach how to do it.
It's hard to mess up math.
It's hard to mess up math. A lot of hard sciences, even when it comes down to the details, that you do just fine from a non-Christian perspective. We trust unbelievers to design our microwaves for us, so we could trust them to teach how a microwave works in a high school class. So I think there's a number of fields in which a secular education can still do a fine job. Of course, there's other areas in which that's not the case, and it's becoming increasingly aggressively anti-Christian. And certainly that's something that Christians need to take into account if they're considering sending their kids to public school.
The biggest problem, it seems, would probably just be the environment in these schools, the moral environment, the sex ed classes, then maybe transgender bathrooms, and the peer influences. This is, it seems, in most cases, an an environment of sheer immorality, and we should not want our kids to be anywhere near that kind of context. Would you agree?
I'd certainly agree. And I would say two things, at least. One is, of course, that if we're talking about the culture of a school, that's going to be determined a lot by the particular school. There are some schools that have a much more corrosive culture than others. And the other thing to say there is, it's not as if having a Christian school guarantees that you're going to have good peer influences. There might be a wonderful official code of conduct, but there could still be all kinds of stuff going on, but behind outside the teacher's gaze. And I know lots of Christian schools where the student culture is almost just as depraved as at many public schools. And even if you're homeschooling your children, unless you're going to make sure they never leave the house, they're going to be mingling with peers, maybe playing soccer or whatever, and they're going to be exposed to a lot of immoral influences. So at some point, you have to say, my job as a parent is to prepare my children to be able to face these dangerous things and to be strong in the face of them and to know what Christ calls them to do. So I think there would be some cases in which that would be true even of a Christian with a public school.
Throughout this conversation, I notice you've been using words like, oh, that wouldn't be ideal, or oh, this would be better, but you've not just come out and said, okay, this would be wrong, it'd be a sin to do this. Why aren't you just coming down and being black and white about it? Why aren't you just willing to say, okay, this is wrong, don't do it?
Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to defend public schools here. I think that Christian education is very important. I think the current revival of the classical Christian education movement is a fantastic thing that should be encouraged, and that the vast majority of time, Christians should keep their kids out of public schools, given the state of things, I think, in our country now, and I think increasingly so. But it makes a difference if we treat it as a prudential question versus a principled question, right? So imagine I'm a pastor. I've got a single mother coming in who's financially struggling. You're really having a really hard time just taking care of her kids, and that she has. Say she gets pregnant again, and she wonders if maybe she's supposed to get an abortion just because she can't take care of who she has. Well, I would say absolutely not, right? I mean, her situation might be more understandable, but that doesn't make it that doesn't make the action excusable.
There's
a black and white principle there. However, the same mother comes in and says, I don't know how I can't homeschool these kids, and there's no good Christian education around that I can afford. I'm going to have to send them to the public school and do my best. Then I'm probably going to say, yeah, that's what you should do, and we'll try to support you as a church as much as possible. Okay? And that thought experiment shows that these are different issues, and one is a matter of, ultimately becomes a matter of prudential judgment where, given these considerations, this is usually a bad thing, but given these considerations, it might not be a bad thing in this case. And realizing that should help us avoid making these kind of pronouncements and judging other Christians and making these kind of blanket statements saying all Christians have to do this in a way that can become very divisive and do a lot of harm to Christians who are really struggling in situations that might not have ideal options for them.
So you're saying that there are the essentials, which are the moral absolutes, and then there are the prudential things, which are matters of wisdom and folly. And both matter, but they just matter in different ways.
Exactly.
Thanks, that's helpful.